Welcome to the Know Before They Grow podcast. Today, Josh and Jess have an interesting discussion on the topic, can a woman force a man to perform a paternity test? So sit back and take notes during this special informational episode.
All right, so we've got a really interesting question to dive into today. Someone wrote in wanting to know, can a woman actually force a man to take a paternity test?
And it's a question we get a lot, actually.
Yeah, it sounds like, pretty straightforward on the surface. But we've got a whole stack of legal documents here, and, well, let's just say it gets complicated.
Definitely not a simple yes or no answer here.
Not at all.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with this one?
Well, the first thing to clarify, I think, is the whole idea of forcing someone.
Right, because we're not talking about, physically dragging someone to a lab.
Exactly. Legally speaking, you can't force someone to do something against their will like that.
Okay, so no rogue DNA heists allowed.
Definitely not. It's all about the legal avenues here, and that usually starts with the family court system.
So filing a paternity petition is kind of the first step.
Exactly. It's not about force. It's about initiating that legal process to determine paternity. And once that's established, then you can get into things like child support or custody arrangements.
Makes sense. So those at-home DNA kits you see advertised everywhere, those don't really factor into this, right?
That's a great point, because those home kits, not admissible in court.
Really? I had no idea.
Oh, yeah. For a paternity test to hold up legally, you've got to go through a very specific process. Accredited lab, strict chain of custody, the whole 9 yards. It's all about making sure those results are airtight as evidence.
Wow. So those Discover Your Long-Lost Relatives kits might be fun for a family reunion, but they won't win any legal battles. Good to know.
Right. Different purpose entirely.
So we've got the legal process starting to take shape here. But I imagine this whole thing probably gets even more complicated depending on where you are, right?
You're absolutely on the right track. Jurisdiction plays a huge role in paternity cases. What's standard procedure in one state could be completely different in another.
So it's not like there's one big federal law about paternity tests.
Nope. It's more like a patchwork quilt of laws, which, I'll be honest, can make things a little tricky.
So location matters, and we've got to factor in the whole court order piece of the puzzle, too. But let's say someone gets a court order for a paternity test and they just flat out refuse. What happens then?
Well, that's where things can get pretty serious, legally speaking. We're talking potential contempt of court charges, hefty fines, even jail time in some cases.
Wow, okay, so ignoring a court order isn't just about disagreeing. It's like defying the court's authority directly.
Exactly. The court system takes this stuff very seriously. But it's important to make a distinction here. Refusing a paternity test before court gets involved, that's a slightly different ballgame.
Okay, so let's say someone just asks for a test directly, no court order or anything. What if the other person says, nope, not doing it? What then?
Right. So in that scenario, there aren't immediate legal consequences in the same way as, say, defying a court order. But, and this is important, that refusal often becomes the trigger for the other party to go ahead and file that paternity petition.
Ah, so it's kind of a strategic move in a way. You refuse the test, and that might be the very thing that leads to legal action being taken.
Exactly. It all ties back to that idea of action and reaction.
This is getting interesting. And speaking of interesting reactions, there's this whole other concept our listener mentioned, presumed paternity. I feel like that's a whole other deep dive, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a big one, for sure.
So break it down for us. Presumed paternity. Is that just a fancy legal term for assuming the husband is the father?
Essentially, yeah. It's rooted in the idea that if a couple is married, there's a legal presumption that the husband is the father of any children born during the marriage. It's tied to that historical and social context of marriage as this legally binding contract and family unit.
Makes sense on the surface. But, and I'm just flipping through our listeners' documents here, it says right here that this presumption can actually be challenged. So even with a marriage certificate, it's not always a done deal. Tell me more.
Yeah, it's definitely not always straightforward, even with a marriage certificate involved. There are situations where that presumption of paternity can be challenged, absolutely.
So, what kind of situations are we talking about here? When might someone say, hold on, this whole presumed father thing, it doesn't quite add up?
Well, think about situations like if a couple was separated around the time a child was conceived, that could raise some red flags. Or if there are, serious doubts about the biological connection itself, those are instances where you might see a challenge come up.
So it's not just a matter of were they married or not when the child was born. It gets down to the nitty-gritty of biology. even within a marriage.
Exactly. And to make it even more interesting, this is another area where those state laws we talked about, they come into play big time.
Figures. So what, like some states make it easier to challenge paternity than others?
Some states have really strict timelines for challenging paternity. It could be a matter of a few years after a child is born, and then you're out of luck. So knowing your rights and when you can actually exercise them is super important.
Okay, so this is way more complicated than just a simple yes or no question.
Yeah.
We've got the legal process, we've got these different state laws, we've got challenges popping up even within marriages. This is why you need to do your homework, people.
No doubt. It's not a journey you want to take without a map, that's for sure. And actually, speaking of navigating tricky legal territory, your research also touched on another interesting angle I wanted to ask you about. We've been talking about fathers in a general sense here, but there's a distinction between how the law looks at unmarried versus married fathers, right? Especially when it comes to this whole idea of contesting paternity.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I bet those situations come with their own sets of rules.
Exactly. Unmarried fathers often face an uphill battle when it comes to establishing or challenging paternity. It's not that they don't have rights, but the process of securing them might look a little different.
I can see that because like we were talking about earlier with married couples, there's that built-in presumption of paternity. So if you're not married, you're starting from square one in a lot of ways.
You got it. It's like in many cases, an unmarried father might actually need to take extra steps to establish his paternity before he can even ask for things like custody or visitation. It's not as cut and dry.
So it's not just about the paternity test itself. It's about what legal doors that test opens, especially for unmarried fathers.
You hit the nail on the head. And that's another reason why, no matter what your situation is, talking to a lawyer who knows the ins and outs of your specific state's laws is crucial. We can lay out the general ideas here, but we're not giving legal advice, unfortunately.
Definitely not. This is all about empowering our listeners with knowledge, but when it comes to making decisions about your life and your family, always, always talk to a professional.
Couldn't agree more. It's important to remember that while we've been, digging into the legal weeds here, paternity is about more than just a court case or a legal definition.
Oh, for sure. We've been knee-deep in legal terms and court procedures and all that.
Right.
But at the end of the day, this is about real people, real families, real emotions.
100%. Establishing paternity can have huge implications that go way beyond child support payments or custody battles.
Like what? Give us the big picture.
Well, for starters, it can completely change your understanding of medical history. There's the question of inheritance rights, too. And then there's the emotional weight of knowing your biological family, which is huge.
It's about understanding your roots, where you come from, and like you said, potentially making crucial decisions about your health based on your family's medical history. It's bigger than just a court order.
Exactly. And, your research even touched on this with that story about your friend who found out about their ancestry through one of those DNA tests. It's just a good reminder that paternity isn't just about legal battles. It's about identity. It's about family connections. It's about understanding your place in the world.
It's one thing to know, the technical details, but then there's this whole other layer of, the human experience, the actual impact it has on people's lives.
Right, exactly. And those stories, like the one with your friend, they remind us that this isn't just an abstract legal concept. It gets really, really fast.
For sure. So I think we've covered a lot of ground here, but let's bring it back to our listener who sent in this question. They were really curious about this whole idea of whether a woman can force a man to take a paternity test.
And they came armed with research. I'm impressed. Always love a good deep dive.
Me too. So, based on everything we've talked about, what's the takeaway? Can we give a simple yes or no answer?
Honestly, I don't think so. Not without knowing way more about their specific situation.
That's fair. But even if we can't offer a cut and dried answer, I think we've given them a lot to think about.
Definitely. We've explored the legal processes, how those processes can differ from state to state, the whole concept of presumed paternity, and then those additional hurdles that unmarried fathers often face.
Plus, we've highlighted how important it is to look beyond just the legal stuff and consider those bigger emotional and familial aspects.
Right. It's about making informed decisions for everyone involved.
Absolutely. So, to wrap things up for our listener today, I think the big takeaway is this. Paternity is complicated. There's the legal side of things, for sure, but there's also this whole other layer of personal meaning and impact that's just as important, if not more so.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Understanding both sides of that coin is what's going to allow you to make the best choices for yourself and your family.
And on that note, big thanks to our listener for sending in such a thought-provoking question. Until next time, deep divers, keep those brains engaged. We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Know Before They Grow podcast. Please make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel. If you need reliable DNA relationship testing services, don't hesitate to contact IDTO at 88-820-40583 or click the link in the description to visit them online today. Thank you for listening. Take care.